Perhaps no other wrestler is more responsible for influencing the current generation of hardcore wrestlers than the one and only Arabian madman known as the Sheik. Famous worldwide as the most insane, violent, and bloodthirsty competitor in pro wrestling, the Sheik was hardcore decades before anyone had come up with the term to describe his style.
From Syria,
his maniacal ring technique and persona, not only to mention his penchant for participating in overly gruesome, ultra-violent matches, set a standard that hardcore wrestlers are still trying to equal some 40 years after his debut.
And we welcome you to another Dark Side of the Ring edition of This Is Wrestling. It is Lee Versage alongside Zach McGibbon. And today, Zach, we look at the life of the original Sheik, who was born in the 1920s and appearing in the 1990s. Welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, Lee. I'm looking forward to this conversation around the Sheik, a wrestler that, as you mentioned, a little bit even before you were watching, Lee, with his peak being in the 1960s and 70s, and a really influential wrestler as well. A guy that I always hear about from relatives and other people I've worked with here at Belleville as well. Talk about the Sheik traveling through into the area. Part of Maple Leaf Wrestling and his rise in Toronto. So that's how I'm familiar with the Sheik, but interested to break down everything else with the Sheik when it comes to Detroit, and obviously helping mentor his nephew, Sabu, which, you know, the timing the episode came out with Sabu's passing was quite something. But yeah, interested to talk about the Sheik here today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more interesting careers in the world of professional wrestling. And I'm like you, I first heard of the Sheik through my grandmother, who was a big wrestling fan in the 50s and the 60s. And she would always tell me about some of the people that she would go down to Maple Leaf Gardens to see, the Sheik being one of them. And you know, I'd heard stories I'd never really seen. And then when I started to, you know, mature in my wrestling watching and knowledge, Zach, so that would have been probably last year. No,
I was going to say, recently.
Hopefully a little bit before that. But I think for me, one of the places that I really started to understand was, again, and I go back to this a lot, it's my influential time as a wrestling fan when I turned from being, hey, I like it, I watch it, it's on. I used to watch Maple Leaf Wrestling at 7:00 with Billy Red Lions on Saturday nights. And, you know, Saturday night's main event, that was always a big Saturday. If, you know, Maple Leaf Wrestling at 7 and Saturday night's main event was on 11:30, I thought that was pretty cool. But when I started to really become more than just a casual fan was when I tape traded and when I started to get into, you know, the very beginning. I started when Eastern Championship Wrestling was turning into Extreme Championship Wrestling and the tape trading. And along with that, this knowledge, because of course this was before the internet, which I usually like to say, because yes, people, there was a world before the internet and you had to find out about wrestling in different ways. So FMW was just this thing that you kind of heard about or you read about in magazines that just seemed almost unbelievable. Like this couldn't really happen. And I remember as, you know, a young kid with some of these things that I heard about in Japan thinking like, is this real? Like, is it different from what I'm watching? But I really started to understand the influence that the original Sheik had when I started watching ECW. And of course, as you mentioned, Sabu and then Rob Van Dam, both of them ended up learning a ton from the original Sheik. So I thought this is a really interesting episode, Zach, and not as dark as some of the Dark Side of the Rings of the past, because I thought they did a pretty good job, especially at the beginning, laying out why he was influential and some of the things that he was doing. It's incredible to me. And maybe you can start with this. The things that he was doing in the 50s and the 60s that carried over into something 40, 50 years later. Like, he was doing things at that time that absolutely nobody else did. I know we say that a lot, but I mean, nobody was doing those things that he was in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, he was really, especially with the gimmick of the Sheik. You know, you have the post-World War II era of wrestling where you have some more of those gimmicks that kind of would go and play off of, you know, historical, what you call, I'll say, rivalries between countries, where, you know, you got these, in the case, obviously, of the Sheik in terms of Arabs, and you've also got with Germans, with the Nazis as well. So kind of playing off of those gimmicks. And, you know, in the case of Ed Farhat, the Sheik, you know, he debuts as, you know, your kind of typical, you know, white meat babyface, just going out there and wrestling and realizing he's got to do something different to make himself stand out. And boy, did he do something to make himself stand out, taking on this Sheik persona. And especially in that era where, you know, I think kayfabe has kind of, I don't think it's necessarily dead. It's kind of evolved in a different way in the modern time, but kayfabe at that time was so strict of, you know, you are playing this character 24/7. And so for Ed Farhat to be playing this character of the Sheik constantly, to the point where even, you know, his family would have to, didn't know what was real and what wasn't. It really just kind of exemplifies just how different of an era it was in the 40s and 50s when it comes to establishing this gimmick and trying to get this gimmick over and having people believe who you are when you're in the ring.
I thought this was maybe the best example of when he would have people over for dinner at his own house. The heels would be in one room and the baby faces would be in another room.
Yeah.
I think that's incredible. Like, I think that's really incredible to go that far. And, you know, you heard a lot of times, you know, people saying if you addressed him as anything else, you couldn't address him as Ed, which is his real name.
Yep.
You had to address him as the Sheik.
Yeah.
And if you didn't address him as Sheik, then he wouldn't answer. So I actually really appreciate this about the business, but there is a full conversation, and maybe we can have it as we're not reviewing an episode, but at another time, of, you know, back in the day, as you mentioned, it was much different than it is now. But where is that line, that perfect line of not going too far in trying to keep kayfabe, but going far enough that you actually make people believe? It's a fascinating question. And I know that question, the answer has evolved, right? From the 60s to even the 80s, and then, you know, the 90s, and now to where we are today. It's changed a lot, I think, the answer to that question. But the most, I don't know. Do you think he was, up until probably Bruno Sammartino, the most successful wrestler ever?
That's a great question.
Zach?
I knew you were going to say it as soon as I said it.
Right. Zach, I only ask great questions.
That's right.
So while I appreciate it, it's my job. It's also your job to ask a great question now and again. So try and mix one in, but
throw one out there.
Yeah, at any point.
At any point.
No, I just, that's part of my gimmick, folks. I'm sorry if you don't like
See,
it.
this is a commitment to kayfabe right here.
That's right.
That Lee is trying to do.
It's part of it's part of Hornswoggle's gimmick to not give up that he's Hornswoggle.
Well, hold on. Let's not go too crazy now.
Kind of the same. But so if I had to ask you who the most, like the three most successful wrestlers ever were before Bruno Sammartino, and I get, like, in women, I mean, Fabulous Moolah held the belt forever and ever and ever.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we put her in that
No,
category.
I wouldn't. That's more like booking yourself to be the champion as opposed to actually being a successful
Right.
drawing champion.
Well, and look, the Sheik had some of that,
Oh, yeah.
booking himself on top for a long time. But if I had to ask you, just even before this episode, who is the most successful wrestler ever before Bruno Sammartino? I don't know. Maybe I'm not phrasing it properly when I say the most successful or the most well-known or the most influential, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yep.
Is probably in the category, at least. The Sheik would be.
Oh, definitely. He would absolutely be in the category. I don't know if he'd be number one. I think, I would think of somebody like an El Santo or a Ricky Dozan.
Yeah. Well,
Right
Ricky
off the
Dozan
bat,
and Ricky Dozan was probably going to be my first
yeah.
answer to that question.
Yeah.
But not everybody in North America knew Ricky Dozan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Gorgeous George was another one that, back in the day, that was the first wrestler I ever knew about from my grandmother, Gorgeous George.
Oh, well, there you go.
And Bobo Brazil was right there too. And he obviously was involved in this episode a little bit, just with, winning the title at tumultuous times in Detroit with the riots and stuff. But I guess my point being is that that's a pretty long time from whenever professional wrestling first began to Bruno Sammartino, that the original Sheik is one of the most influential people of, 60, 70 year time frame. And I find that amazing. So to have him be so influential, I think one of the first sad parts about this show to me, Zach, was how influential he was in whether it was anything hardcore, chairs, stabbing people, forks,
Fireballs.
Fireballs was, number one. We'll get to the crazy match in Japan
Yes.
in a little bit. But yeah, I mean, he was so committed to doing things that other people didn't do. I just think his mark on the business, until it started to turn, his mark on the business was maybe as good as anybody. Incredible.
Absolutely. And it, like what we were kind of mentioning before, it kind of set a mold of how kind of people look in terms of wrestlers and gimmicks and how far that they could go. And that really kind of came to with Gorgeous George, he was obviously a gimmick when he was going out there and trying to play up a character. The Sheik obviously going out playing a character, and seeing more of these other wrestlers going out there and playing a character. It really kind of set the stage. And in the case of the Sheik, he's probably the most successful from a drawing perspective, and especially longevity of drawing perspective. When you look at his time in Detroit, which they talked about, where he was really at his peak in terms of drawing ability, and I would argue as well his in-ring ability. Right. Funny enough, right around the peak of Detroit as well in the 1960s. And then obviously being able to carry that over into Toronto and having a really long reign as well in Toronto, and having a lot of the matches. And one of the things that they do mention, which we'll also talk about here, is that when you do something for so long, when you have a gimmick like the Sheik, where he's, constantly getting one up over, you do get some instances where they talked about with the riots, as you mentioned, in Detroit, where Sheik decided that now is the time to have a loss, and it would be against Bobo Brazil, as you mentioned. There would be moments like that, but overall, during the Sheik's time on top, he was always, winning his matches. But the thought being, well, he's drawing a lot of money on doing that, so why waste a good thing? But eventually, as time goes on and the fans start seeing the same thing at the main events, whether it be at Cobo Hall or whether it be at Maple Leaf Gardens, you start to kind of see a patterns like, okay, this guy can only win for so long and be on top. We need to have somebody we could cheer for that could finally, overcome the Sheik. And I think that eventually kind of led to his sort of, I don't want to say downfall, because like what you mentioned, there wasn't really a big downfall. There's certainly been down periods in his career, but there wasn't really that dark side of the ring in this episode. But in terms of one of the first real big kind of downfalls was outside of that peak of Detroit and Toronto, when he just kept repeating the gimmick over and over and repeating a lot of the stuff you would see in the matches and not really setting up for that babyface to kind of come up and take that mantle. It just kind of shows that first real downfall of the Sheik.
Were they describing the NWO or the Bloodline or the Sheik?
History kind of repeats itself, doesn't it?
So this is one of the big lessons that I think you take from, a lot of successful people. We've mentioned this over and over on these shows and on our regular shows on This Is Wrestling. Is like the most successful people ever book themselves to be on top the majority of the time. And that sucks. And I think the two biggest anomalies from that group that you could say, and certainly Hogan was one of those people, and there's so many. When people were on top and they were really good, they just didn't want anyone to beat them, and they did whatever they could to hold their spot. It's most of the greatest of all time. The outliers, I mean, we've discussed Bryan Danielson a lot. Certainly Ric Flair was an outlier.
Terry Funk,
as well.
I would say.
Yeah, Terry Funk as well. But I understand it to a certain point when you're the one that owns the business and you're the one that's bringing in money like he did with Big Time Wrestling in Detroit, and you're the one that's putting 12, 13, 14,000 people there, that a lot of them are coming to see you, and you losing time after time isn't great. But as you said, you as a fan, you needed the idea that somebody could beat this person. And that's why I'm going to pay my money. Could this be the night that somebody beats him? And if you take that away from a fan, it's all over. And I never quite understand. Hogan did it for a long time, and people grew very bitter of him. People have grown very bitter of a lot of people that have done that. And this seemed to be the case here. I think there are a lot of good things about the Sheik. I think he was an innovator. I think one of the heroes in this episode who we never really heard all that much about, but boy, his wife Joyce just stuck by him.
Yeah.
Through and through, no matter what. And incredible. Like, I came out of this episode going, Joyce must have been an absolute hero.
Yeah.
But again, he was the Sheik. He was Ric Flair before Ric Flair, because he spent a lot of money keeping up his gimmick, keeping up his lifestyle. And that when that went away, Zach, you can see the desperation that was probably inside him to try and keep that, maybe for his wife and maybe for, some other people in his family, but for himself, for his lifestyle. And that's a really bad mix when you don't have that staying power and you are holding on for desperation and doing whatever it takes. That's a really bad mix. And that seems to be what happened to the Sheik as time moved on, after like into the 70s and the early 80s, that he just couldn't understand that he wasn't that top draw anymore. And he wanted to keep his lifestyle. That's a bad mixture.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what you mentioned, being able to go back in time in history and kind of learn from things on that, because Sheik's kind of the originator of that. Trying to keep up and maintain the lifestyle. There was a point where he was going to Japan and getting some bookings with Baba at All Japan, but he was never going to be in that same crop of the gaijin there in Japan, like a Bruiser Brody or an Abdullah the Butcher. Like, he was certainly popular there, but he was not at those peaks, especially Dorian Terry Funk around that time that he was wrestling. He was not going to be able to reach those peaks when he was wrestling Japan. And so you have, obviously the decline of his promotion, and funny enough, the decline of his promotion, you can't even really argue that, the WWF was looking at expansion that time. Like, that was a couple of years after really big time kind of ceased operations of the promotion. And so, yeah, it's after that, you try and live this lifestyle. You want to try and show people, yes, I am the Sheik. I'm the guy that's been the face of wrestling here in Detroit or the face of wrestling here in Toronto for the longest time. And eventually it all kind of comes back and you just keep on spending and spending and spending. And fortunately for him, even in the in-between times when, bookings were slow at best in the 80s, that there would be somebody in the wings and within his family that he could latch on to for one last little hurrah in the 90s, and that would be his nephew Sabu.
And so that's where the story to me got really interesting, was when it started to decline for him. He took too long, right? Like he ended up not realizing that the business was passing him by. And that was sad. But then he was able to turn that, and you could see the good intentions in him, right? To have his nephew, Sabu, and then eventually Rob Van Dam to come in and learn and give back to the next generation. And I thought, to go full bore, like the story he told about Sabu coming and Sabu like chopping wood and putting the ring up and taking the ring down and never getting in the ring for 7 months. Like, who would do that
Right.
anymore? And Sabu did, and then he finally got in the ring and learned a ton from the original Sheik. So I thought that was kind of a nice turn to the story, because you could see, okay, a big rise to fame. He keeps the fame. He actually stays too long and loses a lot as it's going down. I thought, and that was another kind of sad part, and I'm glad they tell these stories. You just wish, like, I look back on the career of the Sheik and I think, man, if he only was smart enough to stock away all the money while he was on top and literally counting and printing money along the way, because no athletic commissions there, and they were just raking in money.
Yeah.
To be able to do that and to be able to kind of give back to the next generation and still have money instead of working indie bookings for a couple $100 because he didn't have any money after he made so much. I always think that that's really sad, but you could see the intention of giving back to Sabu and Rob Van Dam, who, to me, that's where it turned this story into, okay, he really was able to help a couple of people reach the top of the business. I mean, Sabu and Rob Van Dam are going to go down as legends in the business, and that's due to the original Sheik. To be able to put into context, Zach, what you think Sabu learned and then watch his career, I thought he was a pretty good hybrid about what the Sheik was and some of the things, but also the athleticism. He would lose. He would understand the business a little bit more and be a little bit more dynamic and evolve with the business. So I have a lot more respect for Sabu after watching this as well.
Yeah, and it really kind of puts his career into perspective and what you kind of learn about how Sabu was trained and what he learned. Because, when we were talking about Sabu when he passed, the thing with Sabu we always talked about was how, like, when he was going out there was this sense of danger when he would go out there, in a good way, of this unpredictability that you wouldn't expect from a wrestler. And a lot of that you could trace back to the Sheik, because there was that same sense of danger, that same sense of unpredictability. Whenever he would come out, fans would, be there and think, what's the crazy thing that Sheik is going to do here? When's the fireball coming out? When's the chair going to be used, right? What's the next sort of hardcore element to professional wrestling that the Sheik will bring? And Sabu, like you mentioned, he kind of modernized that and incorporated different elements to his wrestling style that eventually, became the forefront for ECW later on. But also, really kind of coming to the fold in the late 80s, early 90s, starting to make his name on the independents during that time in Detroit, funny enough, in that same area that Sheik was running, but then being able to get himself noticed. And you would know this better than I would when it comes to sort of Sabu's rise and being notable and being talked about as this guy that's like, who is this Sabu guy? You always read about him and you wonder, and you see all these pictures come out, and you're like, is this guy really real? And then obviously, like what you mentioned, what really kind of helps cement that legacy for Sabu and also Sheik in a sense was that big fire match that happened at FMW.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. 1992, May the 6th, the Sheik and Sabu against Onita and Goto. The ring ropes replaced with flaming barbed wire. And as they told the story, like they thought that they had it all worked out and practiced it. And then they were in a stadium and the wind changed and it became an inferno. And like even watching the footage, it is scary. It is absolutely scary why they didn't bail out sooner. And the craziest part of this story is that with 3rd-degree burns on his skin and the fire inside the ring, he's trying to light the fire outside the ring.
Yes.
Because that's his gimmick. That's what he does. I'm going to fire to the face as there's an inferno inside the ring. What do you know of May the 6th, 1992?
So FMW is kind of something that, obviously I know that Onita was on top of the promotion there, a big time star, and it was something very different in Japan around that time because, it was the big two of New Japan and All Japan, where with New Japan you had the Strong style, the Inoki kind of treating it like a mixed martial arts promotion, but through professional wrestling, and then with Baba, he would promote it sort of like your old school American style promotion in the 70s and 80s. And so when FMW came to the scene, it's funny, and I believe they touched on it on the episode as well, where the influence kind of came from the concession stand brawl in Memphis, in the late 70s, early 80s. And Onita was traveling during that time and working Memphis, and that match kind of stuck to his mind of how he wanted to see professional wrestling later on. And so that's how he was able to build FMW around it. And so he would build the promotion obviously around himself, because that's what you do as a pro wrestler. When you've got a great idea, you put the promotion around yourself. But he ended up being, one of the biggest stars in Japan around that time. And they would just kept pushing the boundaries and a bunch of different styles of death matches that became synonymous. And, later on you would have Terry Funk and Cactus Jack that would take part in matches at FMW. But I think this fire match really kind of put FMW in a weird way on the map for people across the ocean, across the Pacific Ocean into the States, because this was the match that, you don't even have to watch the video. You could just see some of the photos from that match, and you see the towering inferno that was around the ring, and you just see those visuals, and it's kind of what goes back to what you say there, Lee, in terms of like, you see this and you can't believe, you're asking yourself if this is real, what they're doing out there, because it just seems so unbelievable what they're doing. And it's at FMW, it's always about pushing the boundaries. We'll do an exploding barbed wire death match. We'll do an exploding match here. We'll have a ring out in the middle of the water, and we'll have it also explode as well. A lot of explosions in FMW. They were big on that during that time. But it was always about pushing the boundaries and trying to increase the shock value with FMW. And it worked for them because they were able to draw a lot of people to their shows. And so this fire match kind of became synonymous, because you had all these photos and you see these wrestlers in there, and you're seeing this towering inferno across the ring. And then you hear the stories about the 3rd-degree burns on the Sheik and him trying to get out of the ring, and everybody just kind of barely getting out of there. That's where this kind of legend, this lore kind of continues to come in, and it became one of those shows that was such a hot tape trader item as well, because everybody wanted to see what this match looked like.
Yep, for sure it was, because that's, I kept hearing about it from my friends who were tape traders. You got to see this. You got to see this. I remember watching it once, and that style wasn't for me. I remember watching it once and it going, yeah, this isn't for me. I don't know what this is. So, he had another run after that, when, I thought it was cool that and I had forgotten that he accompanied Sabu in WCW at Halloween Havoc, and didn't realize that he broke his leg at that time on a spot with, was it Jerry Lynn, right?
Yep. Mr. JL to you,
Mr.
sir.
Yeah, I apologize. Jerry Lynn was wrestling Sabu, and they did the spot where they got the Sheik was there, and I'm not sure he knew it was happening, but he ended up retiring after that and leaving. And that was, I think he was 72 at that point, and then, yeah, and then a few years later, unfortunately, he had heart failure and passed away at the age of 76. But you can see so much good in this episode. Like, to me, there's a few mistakes along the way, and the big mistakes were spending too much money at the time and then continuing to put yourself over to the point that people were turning away and not having a handle on the business because it became more about yourself. But in saying that, he innovated like nobody else and continued that for a very long time, and then was also able to transition that into producing not only a star in his nephew, but another star as well that have gone on to massive careers as well. So there's a lot when it comes to the history of the Sheik, because he was around a very, very long time. But I have so much more appreciation. I knew what he was. I knew what he did in the business. But after watching this, I have so much more appreciation for the depths that he would go to because he loved the business, Zach. And that's what I got out of the end. Yeah, there were some sad points, and there's some points that, like I just said, that you wish he had not have done. But did the Sheik love the business of professional wrestling? Yeah, he did. And I think it would be interesting, in reading up on him afterwards, that to me, it's super sad. They didn't say this in the documentary, I don't believe, but he kept kayfabe his whole life, but he did sit down with a biographer and gave countless interviews in, no kayfabe going, and those documents got sealed after he passed, and they were never printed. But there was a book, Blood and Fire, that was released in 2022, and I know that your good friend Dave Meltzer, you and Meltzy, it's like Hornsey and Meltzy. It's a great team. Do you go Meltzy and Hornsey, or Hornsey and Meltzy?
No, I think I just say Big Dave. I think that's how I put it.
Yeah.
Big
but
Dave?
the book won the Best Pro Wrestling Book Award of 2022. And so if you want to read up more, I will be seeking out this book and reading more on the Sheik, because that's how influential he was after watching this.
Yeah. I think we actually did an interview with the author many years ago. I got to dig deep into the archives now to try and remember, because I believe we did an interview with Brian Solomon, who wrote the book and obviously ended up winning the Observer Award for Best Pro Wrestling Book that year. And I remember just from that interview that he mentioned, it was such a big task to even, start a book like this, because the Sheik was so protective of his character and so protective of kayfabe that, trying to do a big sort of book like this, where it kind of dug a little bit deeper into the life and career of the Sheik, was going to be super tough. But like what you mentioned, he did have some non-kayfabe interviews that were kind of left sealed for later on, and eventually kind of published through this Blood and Fire book. And so I'm going to see if I could try and find that Brian Solomon interview in the archives and see if that could be reshared. Because I remember it being an interesting interview. I think we mostly talked about Toronto at that time, but still a lot that was kind of interesting about him. But yeah, this was that's also a book got to seek out and take a read on. And what I love about episodes like this too of Dark Side of the Ring is it's guys that are legends, but they don't get talked about enough in the general wrestling history sphere. I personally have not seen a lot of discussion about the Sheik, so having an episode like this that kind of puts a new spotlight on it, and having new eyeballs onto the history and career of the Sheik, I think is so important. And I think this episode did a great job of showcasing just the amount of things that the Sheik did during his lifetime, and the effects that we still feel from it to this day in professional wrestling.
Blood and Fire is the name of the book, and Dark Side of the Ring doing, I think, a really good job. Blood, Fire, and the original Sheik, the name of the episode, the life of the original Sheik. For Zach McGibbon, I'm Lee Versage. Thanks again for listening to another edition of Dark Side of the Ring on This Is Wrestling.